Chapter 7. Forgotten. The forest stretched endlessly around Lilith, the towering trees casting long shadows under the fading moonlight. She wiped the last traces of blood from her lips, her ember-like eyes flickering as she took her first steps away from Raphael's crumpled form. The faintest warmth in her abdomen lingered, unfamiliar and unshakable. "How long has it been?" she whispered to herself. Her feet moved instinctively through the dense woods, her wings folding tightly against her back as she glanced at the scattered remnants of a world she hadn't seen in centuries. Everything felt foreign, yet hauntingly familiar. Lilith's thoughts churned. She remembered the golden streets of heaven, her imprisonment, the endless passage of time. Decades? Centuries? They've forgotten me. The trees gave way to a suffocating swamp. The air was thick and damp, the ground squelching beneath her steps. Shadows danced across the murky waters, faint whispers brushing against her ears, though she ignored them. Her ember-like eyes scanned her surroundings, ever watchful for anything that might emerge from the depths. Then she saw it. Amidst the decay and overgrowth stood a structure unlike any other. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic scent that clung to her senses. The soft creaking of old wood and the distant sound of dripping water heightened the eerie stillness as she approached. It rose defiantly from the swamp, its inverted steeple piercing the sky. The stained glass windows were darkened with grime, but faintly, Lilith could make out symbols and figures. The building seemed to pull her forward, its aura unmistakable. Lilith pushed open the rotted wooden doors, her steps echoing through the hollow space. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying the weight of forgotten reverence. The remnants of long-abandoned worship clung to the walls like shadows, with faint etchings of prayers barely visible beneath layers of grime. The silence was punctuated by the faint drip of water from a cracked ceiling, and the walls seemed to breathe with the despair of those who had once knelt here. At the center of the hall stood a statue of herself. It was magnificent once, she could tell, but time had worn away its edges. The stone face was weathered, the outstretched hands chipped, yet the unmistakable power it once radiated lingered faintly. Surrounding the statue were decayed offerings, wilted flowers, broken relics, and long-dried bloodstains. The altars were toppled, the pews broken, and the walls defaced with graffiti, symbols of rebellion, desecration, and abandonment. Lilith's wings unfurled slightly as she approached the statue. Her fingers brushed against the stone, her eyes narrowing. "They left me for this?" she murmured. Her voice echoed in the emptiness, filled with quiet rage. She knelt slightly, her glowing eyes locking onto the hollow gaze of her stone likeness. "I will remind them who they kneeled to," she whispered, her voice low and venomous. Rising to her full height, her wings unfurled slightly, casting long shadows across the desecrated hall. She turned toward the broken altar and raised her hand, brushing it against the crumbling stone. "This cycle ends with me," she vowed, her voice firm and unyielding. With renewed determination, Lilith stepped away from the statue and made her way back through the hollow space. The rotted wooden doors creaked as she pushed them open, and the heavy air of the swamp greeted her once more. Her fiery eyes burned brighter as she stepped into the thick humidity, the whispers of the swamp fading into the distance as her steps grew lighter and her resolve sharper. The swamp eventually gave way to thick forest once again. As the oppressive dampness lifted, Lilith felt a shift within herself. The forest's dappled light and earthy scent brought a fleeting sense of familiarity, but it only deepened her resolve. The tangled roots and hanging vines seemed less like obstacles and more like a test of her growing strength, each step pushing her closer to her purpose. Lilith moved with purpose, her power growing with each mile she crossed. She crushed roots beneath her feet, her wings slicing through hanging vines. The forest seemed to part for her, as if nature itself recognized her dominance. But the forest didn't last. The trees thinned, the air grew drier, and before her stretched a vast desert of endless sand dunes. The heat wrapped around her like a suffocating cloak, but it didn't slow her stride. In the distance, something caught her eye. A road, ancient and weathered, carved into the sand as if it had always been there. Lilith followed it, her wings folded tightly, her ember-like eyes fixed on the horizon. Each step felt heavier, yet her strength continued to grow. the destruction of the churches feeding her like a dark wellspring. The whispers of the desert wind carried fragments of words, memories, and laughter, as if echoing from a distant past she could almost touch. Each fragment seemed to reach into her mind, stirring forgotten emotions and fleeting glimpses of what was once hers. They tugged at her resolve, but instead of weakening her, they sharpened her focus, driving her toward the cathedral that awaited. She ignored them, her focus unyielding. As the dunes stretched endlessly before her, she felt the pulse of her next target, the head of the next church. Somewhere out there, amidst the sands, her next victory awaited. A faint smile crossed her lips as her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen. They will remember. The road twisted and turned, the sun sinking below the dunes as the shadows stretched long. Lilith's steps never faltered, her power growing with each church she destroyed, each leader who fell. As the desert wind whispered around her, she began to hear faint hums, low, melodic, and haunting. They carried on the breeze, guiding her steps like an unseen force. Ahead, silhouetted against the fading light, she saw a cathedral, its towering spires reaching defiantly into the sky. Her ember-like eyes locked onto the structure, blazing with determination. The faint hums of monks intertwined with the wind seemed to echo within her, resonating with the subtle pulse she felt deep within. For a moment she hesitated, her hand instinctively brushing against her abdomen as she processed the sensation. A faint pulse in her abdomen caught her off guard, a sensation both foreign and grounding. She paused for a moment, placing a hand lightly on her stomach, as a fleeting thought crossed her mind. "Let's see who's forgotten now," she whispered, her voice carrying into the empty expanse of the desert as she pressed forward toward the church.